today's meeting. I'm going to say a few little things just by way of introduction. The newspaper article indicated that the leader of the opposition would be here and the mayor of Port of Spain would be here. After that, I went out, the mayor of the opposition leader pulled out. So those of you who got my personal invitation would have seen that her name was no longer there. And this morning, we got a note from the mayor of Port of Spain who indicated that he could attend. Luckily for us, we have the former mayor of Port of Spain, who is a member of the PNM, still Louis. But he is a former PNM mayor of Port of Spain, and he has commented on the matter. So we asked him to take the place, and he very, very kindly agreed to do so, and has agreed to the rules of the game. So unfortunately, we are not going to have the two politicians to discuss this political issue, which is a major shortcoming. But let's hope that between ourselves and you, we will get some advance on this matter. The speakers are, and we are going in this order, Dr. Gabrielle Hosein, who is, we normally have an academic colleague present, and Gabrielle, who was fundamental in organizing this whole thing. She's from the Institute of Gender Studies, Gender Development Studies. She is going to be doing the first presentation. Margaret Sampson-Browne will do the second one when she gets here. She will be followed by a student, former Guild President, are you not, Amilcar? Mr. Amilcar Sanatan, who is going to speak to us on the matter. And then finally, the former mayor of Port of Spain, Mr. Louis Leasing, will address us. Each person has 20 minutes to speak. After when there are 3 minutes to go, I will point out to them that they have 3 minutes to go. And when they have 1 minute to go, I will be telling them to wrap up, and after that I'll physically move them off if they are not there. Because the main reason for this forum, and all the fora in fact, is for you to come and question the people who shape opinions, who shape policies, and who have views on the matter. We're going to get immediately into it, and I'm going to first of all call on Gabrielle to make her presentation. So Gabrielle.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank you all for coming today. The fact that you all are all here is a sign that the issue of violence against women remains one that you think the public has a right for state officials to take seriously, primarily because this issue has been raised in the past couple of weeks because it was not taken seriously enough by state officials. I want to publicly express my disappointment that the mayor of Port of Spain chose to cancel coming this morning. This would have been a very good opportunity for him to say, we have these 3 ideas for going ahead, and I'm showing up to hear your ideas for how we would like to go ahead. And I can only hope that the mayor's cancellation this morning is not a sign of a kind of disappointment that we can expect from him in terms of keeping to his commitments on this issue of gender-based violence as we go ahead. I'd like to say one other thing about the question of the state commitment to gender-based violence, and that is that when I spoke to the mayor himself, the mayor said to me that the state or the government is producing a national gender policy, and that really this is an issue for gender. And I said, no, Mr. Mayor, this is an issue for local government. This is also an issue for the Port of Spain City Corporation, which needs to take the lead in healing a great divisiveness that was created in the society and a lot of disappointment. And that I think you yourself as mayor need to take the most visible role at the level of the Port of Spain City Corporation in showing that we are approaching a way ahead for which protests alone are not the way. So I'd like to publicly register not only my disappointment, but my skepticism and my hope that we are able to see more out of the mayor than he has shown us today. I want to acknowledge a number of persons in the audience, particularly those who continue to fearlessly engage our nation on the question of women's rights, including their rights as citizens to live freely and without fear. This forum was organized as part of what should be widespread efforts to keep public conversation about ending violence against women from going cold. And that's why it's important that you are here. Outside of the protests that happened 2 Fridays ago, which were organized by a number of people, including Dr. Angelique Dixon of the IGDS, outside of those protests, there have been no public gatherings open to the public to continue to elicit ideas and commitments for a way ahead. And that's what this was. And so we are glad, because today is a day that when you are here, you are also able to put your ideas, what you want to see as action items and deliverables on the table. The university itself is an institution that should always participate in challenging the status quo of knowledge and power, as long as our society remains built on sexism, racism, classism, homophobia, and other sources of inequality. And part of the intention of today was to bring political representatives into the various spaces of civil society, rather than us always going to them in their spaces, in small groups, in private meetings. Rather, we bring them to where people's idea of a way ahead with deliverables and deadlines can be more freely articulated in non-partisan terms. The university must also play this role in promoting non-partisan spaces for the public and our officials to come to an agreement about how to advance justice, and particularly justice for women in the widest sense of creating greater gender equality, freedom from fear and threat or experience of violence, and the mainstreaming of women's rights across both national and local government.
Could you let her?
Now, I don't know who in the room is not already cynical of the state and its officials. If you are not one of those cynical people, bless your heart for continuing an optimism that the rest of us struggle to keep alive despite our efforts to continue. However rightfully cynical we are of the state and its officials, the history of feminist organizing in Trinidad and Tobago shows that we rely on that same state and its officials to pass and implement laws and policies, and that we must continue to push both to enact the solutions that we propose. Decades of advocacy has also meant that women's rights struggles should not only take place on the streets, though certainly the streets carry their own visibility, accessibility, and power. The purpose of my presentation this morning is to discuss the significant role of the state in treating gender justice issues as development issues. We asked 2 state officials to come. Some thought that it was creating a partisan environment for discussing these issues, but what it was trying to create a forum in which we see all state parties, regardless of which political party they involved in, as having a mandate by the people to work together in our interest. And the fact that both agreed and then didn't show up tells us something about the kind of vigilance that is going to be required going ahead. Decades of women's rights struggle, even just individual women breaking glass ceilings in ways not considered radical or significant, have provided us with spaces in the state and in the university, and infused an idea that there is widespread shared responsibility for creating a world of gender equality. In human resource departments, in the private sector, as much as in council meetings of the regional and city corporations, as much as in the newsrooms of our media, as much as here at the university. We must work in all the spaces where we are now, where struggles were waged for us to be as gender conscious and indeed even as feminist women and men, to own the kinds of transformation that we wish to see. This is a very important point. What happens when we don't have our rights even acknowledged, or when we don't see them adequately implemented by the state, when there are no consequences for lack of implementation, is that we take to the streets. but decades of feminist work has meant that there are gender-conscious women and men who are also operating in positions of power, power that we have as individuals or power that we have in our positions in a range of other spaces. And we want to encourage us to use those other spaces as well to support the kinds of protests that then need to happen when things have gone too far, right? We want to not wait until things have gone too far and that people are so angry that they have to gather in public spaces in protest. We want to continue to advance this in ways that always push the spaces where we are to see what role that they can play. The kind of transformation that we need to envision and pursue, particularly after the divisiveness and pain created over the last weeks, requires a great deal of trust to move into this future. As Paulo Kernahan said in his February 20th column, through this incident, the government has been shown that it only holds power in trust, and that this trust can be revoked anytime. Speaking for myself, I need to trust that all officials now know that there's a line that has been crossed, which they understand for themselves should not be crossed again. Even women, not in direct threat of harm, feel more unsafe when, wrapped up with a generalized fear of violence, is a fear of being blamed or facing shame or becoming further vulnerable publicly or privately for their experiences of harm. Given that he remains in office, I hope that this line, which should not be crossed again, is now more clear to Mayor Clyde Paul. I hope that we are also more aware that those struggling to end both violence against women and pervasive sexism in how it's addressed by local government in Point Fortin, I hope we all know how much those activists there need our support. Indeed, I need to trust that from corporate HR departments to the range of state branches, there is an understanding of the need for non-sexist language in public life. This is not the kind of thing that you tell us is for gender, right? This is not about the Ministry of Gender, Division of Gender, the Gender Minister. We don't want to hear this is for gender, right? This was a local government issue, but the Port of Spain City Corporation issue remains a local government issue, it remains a state issue, it remains a national issue, right? That you don't understand that all of us have a role to play can be extremely problematic. So I want to press us to make sure that that's a language that we use going ahead. To quote the guidelines for the use of non-sexist language, which are published by the Institute for Gender and Development Studies and are available online, it is now widely accepted that language does, to some extent, determine how we think. Yet as the guidelines continue, there is no sense in changing language and not changing attitudes, of paying lip service to equality but retaining inequality in our minds. In the past weeks, many voices have contributed to continuing public deliberation about violence against women, some which understand the necessity for non-sexist language in public life as part of a larger struggle against violence against women, and some who did not. At the march led by Stephanie Leach, Amanda McIntyre, Khadija Sinanan of Womantra, Attila Springer and Jacqueline Morris, and Dr. Angelique Nixon of the IGDS, there were those considered quote-unquote protesters, otherwise known as regular citizens, with signs that said, "We speak out against sexism and violence. We blame the perpetrators, not the victim. Violence against women is the problem, not our clothes. We need safe streets, not shame or blame. The masquerade is not an invitation. Teach our sons not to abuse women, calling for respect and justice for women, and insisting that public officials be accountable not only for publicly condemning all forms of violence against women, but also ending the blame put on women for such violence." There were other voices, those of commentators, who argued that these protesters should have focused on protesting the heinous murder of Asami Nagakia, rather than state officials' response, and we continue to hope that her killer is brought swiftly to justice. However, in contrast to these commentators, I see violence against women, the responsibility wrongly placed on women to prevent violence from happening to them, and the inadequate response of the state and its officials in both language and action as interlocked. And it is in fact necessary to highlight the culpability of all three. It might seem as if protesting non-sexist, it might seem as if non-sexist language is less important than protesting murder. But it is sexist language that reinforces beliefs and values about women as natural victims, rightfully in certain places and roles and outside of rights when they step out of these, deserving of more discipline to become properly feminine, or some licks if they are too unmanageable, repeated sexual harassment on the street if they are too pretty, or violent judgment if they are considered the wrong kind of woman, meaning the wrong class or race or in the wrong job to be truly blameless. So the challenge ahead is not against visible kinds of marked harm only, but against a culture defined by both lack of safety and blame. Those acts of blame extend, of course, to those who continue to speak out against women's rights issues and violence. Just as that violence continues to target those who are actually experiencing violence in the first place. And here I want to support the women. Must have all seen the letter that was written by Jackie Burgess, Merle Hodge, Sheila Rampasad, Attila Springer, N2 Springer, Verna St. Rosegreaves, and Fulade Matota. They had to publicly remind certain media hosts and houses, and indeed us all, that the best use of our voices isn't in the kind of sexist authority that focuses on telling women what they should be speaking about or doing, but in picking up a bucket and adding, each of us, to the new foundation that we are building, using the stones that the builders of our society have long refused as a head cornerstone. Indeed, decades of workshops, legislative change, lobbying, training, staffing of counseling centers and shelters, fundraising, scholarships, marches, teaching, mentoring, skill and solidarity building has gone on and continues to go on. And the challenges that remain are a sign of how much needs to change, not how much women, yet again, should be told what to say and what to do. Whether in activism or in carnival, constantly reminding women that the terms of their inclusion in the nation are premised on their decency or their politeness, I hope I'm sounding polite, or their continual service is a citizenship issue, for it establishes belonging on terms and conditions set by patriarchal rules. And why should those rule? Rather, what should rule, and what this issue has raised, are those values that end victim shaming and blaming and sexism, including sexist language in public life and by those holding public office. For all are parts of a wider, violent status quo and all are issues of citizenship, harming women, dehumanizing men, and setting back emancipation for all. Accountability to non-sexist language and decision-making might seem insignificant, but it is at the core of equal citizenship, and it is a men's issue as much as it is a women's issue. For those that are privileged in this language have greatest responsibility for ending its rule. Advocacy means continuing a push on the new mayor, who cancelled this morning, I would like to add again, to understand what trust has been put in him, a trust which can be lost. This conversation is part of others that can be and should be happening everywhere, which those gathered at the protest felt should happen everywhere. But while we need to speak in our small groups and communities, we must also call on state officials to be present where we are. I know that the mayor has met with women's rights activists and committed to gender sensitivity training for those in his corporation. But we would also like to know what the deadlines are for those deliverables and what are the consequences for non-delivery. The question activists ask of themselves when they have won small victories is what are the consequences for our leaders when they do not follow through on their promises or meet deadlines. For setting promises and deadlines without consequences is meaningless, which is what we all know from every year when we vote people into office on the basis of promises and see no deliverables. Within Carnival and outside of Carnival, violence remains. And that is why we are here today. It's very simple. Inside Carnival and outside Carnival, violence remains. Violence is a national issue, but given that violence remains centered in Port of Spain in many ways, it is a Port of Spain City Corporation issue. and it is a local government issue as long as Carnival remains marketed by the nation across the nation. And it is a state issue for all officials, regardless of whether or not they are into gender, because it is a question of equal citizenship, for violence prevents people from participating in belonging on safe and equal terms. Women are saying this in visible spaces, in the streets, in offices, in our universities, even on stage. And this issue, we hope, will not just be one about talk, but will actually be one that can carry political consequences, because it does carry consequences. It can result in murder, and also it can result in resignations, having real effects on real lives. I want to leave you with two sets of statistics that are worth considering as we move ahead into this conversation. And one is that from 2011 to 2013, half of the cases of sexual offenses reported did not result in either arrest or charges. And between 2012 and 2013, more than 11,000 new domestic violence cases were filed in the magistrate's court. We are here because violence against women is a development issue and should be a public policy priority, not a matter for gender people, feminist women, but for everybody. As part of our work at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, I would like to let the public know that we are in the process of drafting a course for public officials and parliamentarians titled Non-Sexist Language in Public Life, and we'll be offering this in July and August of this year. Before I go, I also want to mention the Facebook group, Say Something, which is an open group and which creates a space for discussing the next steps by anyone who wants to contribute. The members of that group are also meeting tonight, Wednesday at Belmont, and Dr. Angelique Nixon, who is here, is somebody that you can speak to if you're interested in attending. The Network of NGOs of Trinidad and Tobago for the Advancement of Women and other groups are also planning an International Women's Day March, and we should take this issue, our concerns, our placards, our dreams, and our hopes for less violence in the year ahead, for a country where no one is harmed by gender-based violence, to that march, voting with our feet, as they say. Say Something is also planning an activity in Port of Spain for that day. Let us continue to say and do whatever we can, however we can, wherever we can, to find a better way. And let us hope that the current disappointment that we feel in public officials today is not a sign of what we can expect out of their commitments in the future. We especially want to hold the Mayor of Port of Spain in our thoughts, and to let him know that the Port of Spain City Corporation has a moment for leadership that we hope that they will seize.